I think, the really important insight. The two they're not mutually exclusive.
Well, let's dive into what happened in the 1920s and 30s. So let's go back to the 19th century. You have a lot of German folklore and superstition. There's a long history there in Germany and the surrounding areas of Europe. How did these ideas shape Nazi beliefs? You talk in the book a lot about witchcraft and especially vampirism as being significant to the Nazi worldview.
Well, I think the big point about the 20s that I try to make is you already had what I call a supernatural imaginary that developed in the course of the 19th century, maybe throughout Europe, but especially in Central Europe, that had three kind of elements to it. A kind of neo-pagan or religious renaissance, which wasn't really as invested in traditional Christianity as it was in Eastern religions, neo-pagan religions, witchcraft, as you mentioned. Witchcraft as a kind of Ur-Germanic collection of folk practices or folk religious beliefs, not as some evil thing that had something to do with Satan. Or Satan certainly in this cosmology wouldn't have been evil, right? These ideas percolated throughout the 19th century and were already there to be exploited. Were already widely studied by folklorists and pop culture writers in the 20s. So that's one set of these three clusters of ideas. You then have what I call occult doctrines, right? These ideas like Theosophy, Ariosophy, and Anthroposophy that take three of the more famous doctrines. People who believe that if you learn certain kind of occult and border scientific practices like astrology and pendulum dowsing and biodynamic farming, and you combine that with a belief in Darwin and evolution, you can somehow uncover the real history of mankind and a kind of quasi-religion, or as my colleague Corinna Treitel calls it, a science of the soul. And these kind of syncretic doctrines, which we would call occult, became very popular in the late 19th century, not just in Germany and Austria, in the West in general, and in Russia. And these are very powerful forces in Austria and Germany, these occult doctrines. And then you have, which again, all three of these clusters are overlap in some ways. You have what I call border science, which are scientific practices. The people who believe in them would argue that this is just science. They're just an extension of physics and chemistry and psychology. But they're sciences that mainstream science hasn't yet recognized because they're not tied into the cosmos or the kind of hidden forces that infuse everything in the way that these people are. And this would be parapsychology, cosmobiology, biodynamic agriculture, world ice theory. As I argue in the book, they're really faith-based. None of these border sciences were able to be reproduced reliably in the lab or in nature by people working independently over time. But their practitioners claim they could be. And they didn't want to always, they made it very clear they didn't want to be seen as occultists, that what they were doing wasn't a new version of some occult doctrine. It was an actual science. So, for example, pendulum dowsing, walking around with a divining rod, which is clearly a medieval occult practice, or even a folk practice. The people who did that in the late 19th and 20th century called it radiesthesia, that they were finding radiation, waves of radiation below the earth and coming out of the cosmos using sophisticated, pieces of metal on a string or professional dowsing rods. So this border science, this resuscitation of border science was also very popular by the 20s. And what I argue is the Nazis...
And most of these practitioners have a scientific background, or at least some of them do, right?
Yeah, what was interesting, though, is they would very often have a scientific background that either wasn't the terminal degree. So they had a master's in engineering, but what they were doing really can only be tested if you had a PhD in physics or geology, let's say. Or they were amateur. So they might have been a doctor of law, but they were practicing astrology, right? So some of them did have an academic background, but it wasn't always the academic background you would assume you would need to be working in that border scientific area. And the point I'm making with all of this, which other historians now agree on, is the Nazis were not creating anything new. I'm not arguing that the Nazis came along in the 20s and made all this stuff up and then foisted it on the German people. I'm arguing that in Germany and Austria, these ideas were already very popular among many middle class, lower middle class Germans, some working class. And the Nazis, both out of conviction, because some of them practiced or believed in it, and out of utility, exploited these ideas, both consciously and unconsciously, in getting people to believe in their movement. So it wasn't that they created something new, it's just that they were the only mass party I've seen in German history, in modern German history, and probably in Western history, to have so many ties to these kinds of traditions, pagan, alternative religion, occultism, and border science, and not just have those ties privately, but in some ways consciously draw upon them for political, social, geopolitical reasons.
They're really exploiting this segment of the population.
Right. Or speaking to them, dialoguing with them in a way they can understand that the traditional parties, right, the major parties in the 20s, before the Nazis started to get votes, were the liberals in the center, capitalism, free markets, maybe a little state intervention. We believe in representative government, civil rights, rationality, science. The socialists and the communists on the left, very materialist. And then on the right, you had two parties, the Catholic Center Party, which was grounded in Catholicism. That was their kind of core values. So they, that was kind of a tradition that was pretty insulated from the stuff I'm talking about. And then you had the conservatives who were basically, linked to the evangelical church in some ways, also had some nationalist and folkish aspects. But those are the major parties, and they dominated the interwar period until the late 20s. The Nazis were a fringe movement. And my argument is that part of the reason they were able to succeed by the end of the 20s is they tapped into these ideas, these alternative ways of knowing, in ways that these traditional parties didn't. It wasn't just the Depression. Put it another way, that's important. Without the Depression, the Nazis never come to power. But why the Nazis and not another fringe party, or not the socialists, who, in France and Great Britain, labor benefited from economic crisis, from the decline of liberalism. In Germany, it was the racist pagan right. Well, maybe that's linked to this larger supernatural imaginary that was already quite popular.
Okay, so when we talk about these occultists, I think the